Against all odds, this is a preview of the book by Alex Kershaw. Part 1, Mediterranean. Baptism of fire. The silence was unnerving after several days at sea, crossing from America with the constant grinding of the ship's engines, quiet now in the Atlantic waters off North Africa. But it didn't last long. In the early hours, bells clanged, and then soldiers heard an anchor chains rattle, barked orders, heavy and frantic footsteps, power winches whirring as they started to lower landing craft into the white-capped water. A radio played. 24-year-old Lieutenant Maurice Footsie Britt, to his surprise, heard the voice of President Franklin D. Roosevelt announce that the invasion of North Africa had already begun. We figured he had jumped the gun a little, Britt later remembered. After all, we were still 8 miles from shore. Then, blonde-haired Britt, all 220 pounds of him, took his place in his landing craft. Finally, the craft headed toward the shore. The seas, as far as the horizon, were dotted with transports. Britt belonged to the 3rd Division's 30th Infantry Regiment, whose motto was, "Our country, not ourselves." He was one of 35,000 green American troops in Western Task Force, commanded by General George S. Patton, one of 3 forces attacking French Morocco and Algeria in 3 areas of a 1,000-mile-long coastline, stretching all the way from Safi on the Atlantic to Algiers. The arrival of the first Americans in Europe to fight the Axis powers came at a critical point in the war. After enjoying stunning success against the British 8th Army through 1941 and much of 1942, General Erwin Rommel and his famed Afrika Korps were now on the defensive, having been defeated at El Alamein in Egypt less than a week earlier. In all, the Torch landings, the first joint operation of the war by the Americans and the British, comprised more than 100,000 troops backed by 350 warships from 7 Allied navies. The Americans had tried to negotiate an armistice with the French in recent days, but to no avail. And so an order had come from on high to Britt's division. "Okay, boys, let's play ball." Dawn was now breaking off the coast of North Africa. In the far distance, men could make out the steeple of a Catholic church rising above the port of Fadala. There was the sound of machine gun fire. Bright red tracers spat across the lightning sky. Ahead loomed a flat, broad beach, a couple of miles to the east of Fadala. Britt heard the drone of French bombers and then saw huge fountains of spray as bombs crashed into the sea. It was a pretty sight, he remembered, until suddenly we realized with a sickening feeling that the men in these bombers were trying to kill us. No lectures on the subject, no crawling under carefully aimed machine gun fire will ever make a soldier. He becomes one the instant he realizes the gunfire he hears is intended to kill him. So here's the map from Fadala to Casablanca. So here's Fadala right here, and here's Casablanca right there. And a lot of people say Casablanca, but to each his own. Brit's landing craft ground ashore. Men began to unload it, but then there was a deafening rattle of fire, and Brit looked up and saw a French plane driving toward him, strafing his regiment. There had been no pre-invasion bombardment in the hopes that the French would not put up any resistance. Many of Brit's fellow invaders carried American flags, figuring the French would be less likely to fire on U.S. troops. The flags made no difference. Brit and his men stopped unloading the craft, headed for safety across the beach, and then moved inland. By midday, they had reached a pre-assigned assembly area near a road bridge. Then Brit returned to the beach with a sergeant to salvage the jeeps and equipment he'd been forced to leave in the landing craft. The first edge of my excitement was beginning to dull, and when another strafing plane came over, I hit the beach in utter terror, digging madly into the sand. The plane soon passed over, in search of more targets. For 5 long minutes, Brit lay flat, terrified, trying to summon the courage to get back on his feet. Then he found his landing craft. But before he and the sergeant could pull off several guns and 2 remaining jeeps, the landing craft sank in the rough seas. There was more bad news. Brit learned that a submarine torpedo had hit our transport standing offshore, and all our equipment went down with it. We lost all our barrett bags, food, kitchens, and other equipment. All we had left was the clothes on our backs and the rations we carried. We were tired, sick, and disgusted. Brit and the sergeant had no option but to walk back across the beach and rejoin their company at the assembly point by the road bridge. By early afternoon, Fadala was in American hands, and Brit and his company were marching toward Casablanca, 16 miles to the southwest. Brit's regiment encountered minimal resistance while taking dozens of French soldiers as prisoners. Allied Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower arranged a ceasefire with Vichy French forces 48 hours later, on November 10, and Casablanca was occupied with fewer than 70 men killed from Brit's division. Although by the time the guns fell silent, in all of Morocco there had been some 1,500 Allied casualties. Brit and his fellow Marne men, as the 3rd Division soldiers were known, had been initiated into the full chaos and confusion of combat in a couple of hectic, feverish days. They'd fought with barely any armored support, yet had successfully spearheaded the first U.S. invasion of the war. "My biggest thrill," Bret wrote to his wife, "and one that I'm sure I'll never recapture, was when my boys performed so heroically that at least 3 will be decorated for outstanding bravery." Far bloodier battlefields and much greater danger were in store for Maurice Bret, but unlike so many of his fellow junior officers, His background and training had prepared him to endure the ordeals ahead. Britt had, in fact, trained for combat since the harshest days of the Great Depression, when he first donned an Army uniform in 1937 as a freshman in the ROTC program at the University of Arkansas. He was quick-witted, tough, and humble, with no airs or graces, an optimist by necessity, having grown up dirt poor in rural Arkansas. He was born in the small town of Carlisle, in the state's rice-growing region, and already knew what death meant. When he was 9, his father was badly hurt in an industrial accident and given less than 5 years to live. He lasted 4. Britt's mother was left with 2 boys, 9-year-old Basil, and 13-year-old Maurice, to bring up on her own. Each cent counted, and Britt worked every hour he could, stacking wood, picking fruit, chopping cotton. In high school, he was an exceptional athlete, playing basketball and football and starring on the track team. His teammates nicknamed him Footsie because he had such big feet. Size 12, double E. He studied as hard as he worked to feed his family. In 1937, as his high school's valedictorian, he never forgot his mother's delight when he won a football scholarship to the University of Arkansas, where he majored in journalism, hoping one day to become a sports writer if he did make the cut as a professional athlete. As in high school, Britt was again both a star athlete and a superb scholar, gaining a 5.5 grade point average in his freshman year while winning plaudits for the college's Razorback football team as a nimble, quick-thinking defensive and offensive end. Before his senior year, he'd attended a reserve officers training camp at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, what he regarded on the cusp of his first combat as a priceless experience. Aged 22, Britt fell in love with a high-spirited, beautiful freshman called Nancy Mitchell. After he received his commission as a second lieutenant upon graduating, he and 18-year-old Nancy were married on June the 8th, 1941. Life was simple and serene in those days. 6 months before Pearl Harbor, he reminisced. We were on a honeymoon tour of the Ozarks, and in the fall we went to Detroit, where I had another offer to try out with the Detroit Lions professional football team. Britt was selected for one of 6 roster spots and soon became a regular starter, a professional football player in the NFL. The Lions were a woeful team, losing most of their games, but Britt was highly respected by both fans and teammates for his dedication and endurance. He could take any amount of punishment, and he was a 60-minute man. I recalled fellow Leon O'Neal Adams. I always thought he would make a leader. Another of Britt's teammates was Byron White, a future Supreme Court justice, rumored to be the best paid player in the NFL. There were stories that White was making $1,000 a game, which was a fantastic money, remembered Britt. None of us knew if it was true, and no one asked. We were just glad to have him on our side. It wasn't hard to see that this man was going places. And I'm going to stop. Well, no, I'll go on. No, I'm going to stop here for this evening. Not a bad book. Quite a bit of information as you set up. So I would suggest, if you're going to read this book, that you have a dictionary next to you so you can look up any words or prefixes and figure out what they mean. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May He make His face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up your countenance upon you and grant you your peace. Good night, Stevie.